Here we go. And so today I hope will be the final of these lectures I've been giving to you over the last few weeks over understanding the outcome of the 2020 election in a deeper context and relating it to the development in American politics of deep partisan polarization, and also understanding the way in which perhaps 2020, despite some hopes to the contrary, deepens and accelerates that polarization and what that implies for American politics. Having covered a fair bit of that in previous lectures, what I want to concentrate on today is what, if anything, we can do to remedy polarization. And there's a very good book I've been talking with you about on this. It's a book by, I think, one of our leading political journalists, Michael Tomasky, if we can keep it. And I'm certainly not going to limit myself exclusively to Tomasky's work, but I think it's a very good synthesis and a very good jumping off place for this discussion. Before I do that, we were just talking a moment ago about the pandemic, and I'm sorry to say the surge continues unabated. What we anticipated might be a spike subsequent to Thanksgiving does appear to be materializing. These numbers are staggering. We now are losing roughly the same number of people per day that we lost in the September 11th attacks. I'm sorry to say, but it appears to me that the fatality rate from the coronavirus pandemic will ultimately exceed that in the United States for World War II, right? I mean, so this will go down as one of the worst fatality events in American history, worse than all but the Civil War in terms of a single event causing deaths. And this is not getting better right now. This is getting worse. And as we were talking about, it is increasingly overwhelming our public health care system. And this is really not adequately captured in data. And I don't want to be too morbid about this. You know, each one of these lives is an individual life. Each life lost leaves a trail of grief and suffering with it. These losses are unfairly distributed. They are distributed obviously across underlying vulnerabilities, whether that's diabetes or obesity or heart disease or age. And as we know with the public health metrics in the United States, those underlying health conditions are unfairly distributed. Poor people, people of color, are much more likely to have those underlying health conditions. It's also the case that they are much more likely to be in lines of work and in areas that they live with access to resources such that they are much less able to maintain social distance, stay at home, take other precautions, right? And so there's a social justice, there's a human, and there's just a sheer statistical dimension to this crisis. Having said all of that, returning now to the numbers, I think two things are clear. The first is that the number of deaths is being undercounted, and we're missing deaths related to the fact that the healthcare system is overwhelmed, and so people are dying unnecessarily from other conditions because the healthcare system cannot attend to them in the same way. We're also missing some coronavirus deaths which are not yet adequately tracked as such. And then the hospitalization rate, which is just staggering, right? You know, if you look at this, 200,000 cases in a day is just phenomenal, but 100,000 people in the hospital. And what we need to appreciate is that the hospitals are doing something that you might call proactive triaging. Triaging refers to, right, the distribution of scarce resources in a medical emergency. And the hospitals are increasingly anticipating that they are going to run out of capacity. And the result is that people who they would have admitted to the hospital a month or 2 or 3 months ago they are not admitting to the hospital now, but sending home, right? And so again, in a sense, these numbers don't capture how bad things are in the United States right now. And the virus is bad everywhere. I haven't bothered to update this diagram from a while ago, but you can see the extent of the spread of the virus, right? There's really no region in the United States right now that has this under control, and many regions are being really overwhelmed in terms of their public health infrastructure. And this presents the awful specter of people not being able to gain access to the care that they need. It also presents a real difficulty. There is some light at the end of this tunnel at this point, which is to say vaccines have come online. They are being approved. They do appear to be efficacious. I believe they will be approved soon. My brother-in-law is working a COVID ward in Connecticut right now, and he tells me that they actually already have the vaccine there and that he may get it next week. The moment the FDA gets the clearance, the first line healthcare workers are going to get it. And so that's a really important thing to bear in mind. But here's the other issue, which is with our healthcare system so overtaxed in dealing with the pandemic, we may have trouble distributing the vaccine. We may not have the qualified personnel. We may not have the infrastructure necessary to roll it out as quickly as we could if we weren't at the same time in the grasp of the pandemic. And so all of this to say, as I was saying at the outset, I do think at this point the extreme measures that the governor and mayors and local leaders in California are embracing are appropriate, not just for the next few weeks in containing the spread, but for allowing us as a society to do everything we need to do. And I can only hope that this will spread outwards to the rest of the country, not only to blue states, but also to red states that have been more skeptical about adopting these kinds of policies. I want to just share a little bit of information with you, which some of you may have seen already from the New York Times. This is kind of a public service announcement. They surveyed 700 epidemiologists. They've been doing this for a while, and they're looking at the changes in their behavior. And this is a list of what they are doing and what they are not doing. And the idea here is that these are the people who have the best information, presumably also tend to be cautionary about this stuff. And there are 3 activities that epidemiologists are doing increasingly. And so running errands, such as to the grocery store or pharmacy, 90% of them are doing it. Bringing in the mail without precautions, almost 3/4 of them are doing it. Hiking or gathering outdoors with friends. And by the way, every one of these activities, well, I don't know about the mail, but all these activities are done with a mask on, right? So going outside with friends with a mask on. There is some evidence that maybe if you can stay 5-6 feet apart outdoors, you may not need the mask, or at least it's not as important. But then when you look at everything below that, right? And so the next thing is seeing a doctor for a non-urgent appointment, getting a haircut, right, down to 40%, 30%, sending children to school down to 25%, vacationing overnight down to 20%, eating indoors at a restaurant down to about 10%, exercising at a gym below 10, traveling on airplanes below 8, right? So, and unfortunately, hugging or shaking hands when greeting a friend, 7%. And so, in part, I believe all of you are taking these precautions already. This is something you can share with friends, family, etc., as a way of encouraging them to think through what people who are best informed are doing. Again, if you look at the top 3 least risky activities, bringing in mail, hiking or gathering outdoors, going on errands. And note that they say that going on errands, less than half of them view that as not particularly risky, but it's still something that a lot of them are doing. And here I just want to talk about the approach that they're advocating, which is creating a risk budget. So if you are going to go to a grocery store, then you probably shouldn't be hiking or gathering outdoors with friends, or vice versa. That's an illustration. I'm not trying to dictate to you, but thinking about your overall risk. One of the things we know is that the way in which the virus works, cumulative exposure or overall viral load, determines how well your immune system can fight off a novel virus, right? The immune system hasn't learned to adapt to it yet, doesn't have the information it needs to build the antibodies that are specific to the coronavirus. And so the more of it that's in your system, the more difficult it is, the more likely that your immune system is going to be overwhelmed. If you're going to do one thing, do it once a week, and eliminate something else. Create a risk budget, as they say. Here are the things that they are absolutely not doing: eating indoors at restaurants, attending a wedding or a funeral, attending sporting events, concerts, or plays. Any large gathering indoors, especially if people are not wearing masks, but generally is to be avoided unless absolutely necessary. All right, so now continuing, but looking at what's happening as opposed to with the virus per se, more with its economic impact. And here, what I'm doing is showing you two diagrams which contain essentially the same information presented in slightly different ways. We got new job numbers yesterday. Those job numbers reflect things as they were in the first and second week of November. And so please note that things are almost certainly worse now than they were then with regards to the jobs picture. This is always lagging data. And so what you are seeing here, and in a sense, it's a little clearer on this diagram, which more strongly emphasizes the job loss as opposed to the job gain, but is that we fell off a cliff, right? Steep job losses of the kind that frankly only have precedented the Great Depression, of basically 22 million jobs in April of this year. And then we've seen coming back some fairly robust numbers in terms of the rate of job creation in, for instance, June relative to May or April. But what we're also seeing is a slowing in this trend. And again, this is now almost a month old, this data. I suspect we may see, in fact, that things will go back down in December and especially January once the holiday season has passed, right? And so we're still down basically 10 million jobs. We still have basically half the territory that we've lost to make up. And unfortunately, it's not just that things are slowing down, it's that one particular category that we, if we're paying attention to the overall health of the economy, we need to really concentrate on, is not doing well. And that is long-term unemployment. And here we're talking about 27 weeks or longer, more than half a year. And what we know about people who stay out of the job market for more than half a year is that it becomes much more difficult to get back into the job market. In part, that's because their skills go stale, because they lose their networks and connections, because people just don't think of them as much in regards to work anymore. But it's also about the psychological consequences of long-term unemployment. It's strongly correlated with depression, with lack of motivation, with ultimately a change in identity in which one stops thinking of oneself as a person who contributes to society via wage labor, right? And that once that identity shifts, it becomes much more difficult to motivate oneself, to present oneself, to compete for a job. And I've lectured to you recently, right, in the last 6 months, about the work by Anne Case and Angus Deaton on deaths of despair. And I just want to point out to you, and again, we are in danger of repeating many of the mistakes that we made in reacting to the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. And here I'm beginning to transition into partisan polarization. Those mistakes were driven by partisan polarization, by the fact that, in particular, when Mitch McConnell gained control of the Senate, when the Republicans gained control of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, when he was asked what his top priority was, said it was making Barack Obama a one-term president. And then there was sustained obstruction of various relief packages that the Obama administration wanted to pass. It's not all on McConnell. Right? It's also the case that Obama, even when he had control of the Senate, was perhaps insufficiently aggressive in trying to get through more robust stimulus and relief legislation. But coming back to Case and Deaton and deaths of despair, part of what they point out is that the opioid addiction crisis in the United States was driven by not only big pharma, and particularly Purdue and the Sackler family and the awful stuff that they did in pushing a highly addictive large dose opioid pills into parts of the country that they recognized were experiencing high rates of depression, and using those pills not just for pain management or physical pain management, but also for psychological pain management, right? But it's also the case that what was creating that psychological pain was this long-term unemployment and the consequent change in identity that it brought about in the part of people who had seen themselves as stably employed, contributing members to our society. And that there are things we can and should be doing right now, not only to alleviate the immediate financial stress that people are experiencing as a result of wage and job loss, that includes their inability to pay their rents and other bills, their food vulnerability, which is rampant in the country right now and just awful. All of this in the middle of a pandemic, right? It's an obscene failure of public policy, even if you're just thinking about alleviating immediate misery. But in addition to that, what we know is that if we assist people getting back into the labor market quickly, they will not only remain in the labor market and be productive workers throughout much of the rest of their life, assuming that economic conditions cooperate. So it's good for the overall health of the economy. It increases productivity long term, which increases the tax base, which allows us to pay down debt and do more things with government. It's a win-win proposition. But in addition to that, we also avoid the long-term humanitarian and public health problems that come when people become long-term unemployed and then become depressed, feel that they are no longer contributing to our society. So this is a category I think we need to be paying special attention to. And as we can see, the number of people who are long-term unemployed has increased as a result of the recession. And the thing to know in terms of relating these diagrams, right, is that the people who are long-term unemployed are not even counted in the unemployment data, right? So this data would be worse but for the fact that some people have just dropped out of the data because they're no longer seeking jobs. One last element to this is something I've shown you before, but we're also seeing increased lack of the capacity to sustain employment at the level of state and local governments, right? And this is a double problem, right? This accounts for more than 10% of overall employment in the United States, right? So as local governments lose tax revenue, and that's through sales tax, that's through travel and services taxes, and different states are affected in different ways depending upon the makeup of their economy and their tax base. They are having to lay off people, right? And many states and municipalities are doing 10% across the board layoffs, or at least anticipating doing them on January 1st once federal assistance runs out. And that creates an immediate drag on the economy. If that were to occur, those unemployment numbers will spike dramatically, right? But it also creates a ripple effect because the people who have these jobs right now continue to spend money. The money that they spend continues to employ other people. Finally, it's also the case that in the middle of a pandemic, of course, we are deeply reliant on public servants to provide us with the goods and services we urgently need as a result of our healthcare crisis. We know that domestic violence is going up. We know that child neglect and child abuse are likely going up as more and more children and families are concentrated in their homes. We know that food vulnerability and hunger are going up, that evictions are about to start going up, right? These are things that local governments assist us with. It's also the case that one of the things that's being cut right now is childhood vaccination budgets, which again, right, there will be spill-on effects health-wise from the pandemic if we don't adopt rational policy to deal with it. All right, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but as you are aware, there are negotiations underway in Washington right now between especially Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell. The Trump administration is taking kind of a backseat role to this. The figure that's being floated is, I guess, $800 to $900 billion. The Democrats want roughly $3 trillion. The Republicans opposed half $1.5 trillion, $500 billion. And the fact that Joe Biden is the president-elect has, I think, created some latitude for the Democrats to compromise on the thought that there will be the opening for another bill in the coming months. Clearly, 900 billion will not be enough to meet our needs. The $600 per week supplemental unemployment benefit, just to give you an idea, right? Looking at this economically, but in a humanitarian perspective as well, many people at the bottom of the income scale, when they get unemployment benefits, get around $120 a week. Right. So increasing that by $600 a week, I don't know, you tell me, can you conceive living, paying rent, covering your food bills, medical bills, sundries, having any sort of decency in your life on less than $150 a week? Right. And so if we increase this by $300 a week, which seems like the maximum that we'll get through Congress right now, that makes things better. Maybe not good enough. And we've got to remember the spill-on effects. I haven't focused in this diagram on what's called the payroll protection plan, but this would be, I think, another really important priority, probably not for this round of negotiations, but for the next round of negotiations. These are loans, low interest loans from the federal government to small and middle-sized businesses. As it turns out, it looks like a lot of them went to large businesses, I think against the intention of the legislation in the first round. And they allow businesses to borrow to continue to employ their employees. And if they actually use that money in this way, much of the loan or the will be converted into a grant, which is to say forgiven, right? And so there are so many things that we could and do need to be doing. But if partisan paralysis prevents us from doing it, if in particular an attitude that suggests that anything that is advantageous to the other party is to be avoided at all costs, and so that if while Donald Trump was president, things got worse and Joe Biden comes in and things get better, that is disadvantageous to the Republican Party. Never mind that it's good for the American people, our economy long term. It's a non-starter. It won't happen. It can't be done, right? And that is unfortunately the extent, the depth, the viciousness of partisan polarization that we're facing right now. The phrase from Mitch McConnell that we heard a couple weeks ago, which is that he opposes state and local bailouts because they are, quote, a blue state bailout program, right? And if you look at this map, right, it is the case that some blue states are doing worse in terms of their budgetary shortfalls. But it is also the case that there are many red states, including very populous red states, as well as many purple states that are experiencing severe local government shortfall. But let's put the accuracy of McConnell's statement to the side for a moment. Just think about the statement for a second, right? So he doesn't want money from the federal government going to support California, which, by the way, is one of the largest contributors in terms, I should say, the largest contributor to federal coffers overall, because it's a blue state. That should, in a sense, capture better than anything I can say how problematic polarization is in the United States right now, that we've stopped thinking of ourselves in terms of common citizenship and really confined our understanding of each other to purely partisan categories. Again, I don't want to be redundant or belabor points I've already covered with you. We talked with you last week about how we're still trying to figure out what happened in 2020. What I want to share with you, right, is a question of how much this was a simultaneous red wave and blue wave election. That Donald Trump got more votes in this election than any other presidential candidate in US history, with the exception of Joe Biden. It's only because of this remarkable turnout for Biden that Trump was not reelected, not because of any shortcoming of support for Trump. Right, and so offsetting waves. How much of this was ticket splitting? Right, we talked about this last week, and the two hypotheses. One of them that Trump repelled a certain number of Republicans, but they don't trust the Democrats, and so they voted against Trump but for Republicans. Or alternatively, that maybe they're just slowly shifting their identities. These affluent suburbanites are slowly but surely, as the Southern Democrats did a generation or two ago, becoming more Democratic. But of course, it was the move in the other direction with the Southern Democrats becoming more Republican, but that doesn't occur all at once, and it tends to occur with the president in the first place. Well, what we know now then I'll just share a little bit of this data with you, is perhaps that ticket splitting was not as widespread as perceived. And so what this data from 538 shows is that when we look at the Senate, there are only actually 3 races for the Senate. Ben Saski in Nebraska is the big outlier here, where either the Senate Democrat outperformed Biden by more than 5%, or Biden outperformed Senate Democrats by more than 5%. Other than that, this is a pretty normal band of ticket splitting. And if you note, everything in the House was within this band. And the result is, and it's almost funny, that it looks like Biden won between 222 and 223 congressional districts. And guess what? That's how many Democrats there will be in Congress this year. So perhaps a little bit less ticket splitting than we had thought. So what's really happening here is not that people voted for Biden, but also voted Republican. There's some of that, and it's hundreds of thousands of votes, but it affects the composition of the Senate and the House. What's really happening is just an awful lot of people are voting both directions, right? And so this election does indicate that we are deeply fractured as a country. Now, what I want to get into, the new material I have for you today, is to talk about the analysis of where the polarization is coming from. And as I've said to you, I'm drawing primarily on Michael Tomasky, but there's a whole bunch of literature here. If anybody's interested in this, feel free to email me. Bill Bishop got this whole conversation started in Partisan Sorting with the Big Sort. Daniel Rogers, The Age of Fracture, which I've spoken with you about before, I think covered this very well at the cultural level. And then Grossman and Hopkins and Abramowitz are long-standing political scientists writing on these topics and doing so in a very interesting way. Last week we spoke, sorry, wrong slide. Let me start by giving you an overview of Tomasky's division of American history by phases of partisanship. And so he divides us into 4 ages. The age of creation, right, which is up until the Civil War, when on the one hand, although the founders did not anticipate and George Washington resisted the idea of there being parties came onto line, right? Federalists and anti-federalists and Democratic Republicans, et cetera, right? And the big issue was the unresolved issue of slavery. And it took 80 years to come to a full-blown crisis, but that throughout that period, whichever the 2 main parties were, and there almost always were 2 main parties, and by the way, one of the things that Tomasky points out is that when you have single member districts, territorially based districts, that are the way in which you conduct your elections. So basically, parties fight it out to be the first past the post, the candidate to get the most votes within a district automatically gets elected, right? And those districts almost always produce 2-party systems. This is called in the political science literature Duverger's law, after a French mid-20th century political scientist who said, look, this is as close as a law we have in political scientists. You have a single member district, territorially based, you're going to get 2 parties. It happens everywhere. And it happened in the United States. We, in a sense, led this. we are in a decided minority in having that kind of electoral districting. It produced two parties from more or less the beginning, but the two parties that competed with each other, and they had different names, they were different parties at different periods during the Age of Creation, were almost always, I should say always, cross-cutting coalitions on the issue of slavery. There were people in the same party with opposed opinions on slavery. Candidates, politicians, factions, coalitions. And the result was that the polarization of the United States around an issue that eventually led to civil war didn't play out as partisan polarization per se in the Age of Creation. The Age of Power refers to the age that comes after the Civil War and through the Great Depression, right? And this is an age in which American politics nationally is dominated by the Republicans, mainly Republican presidents, mainly Republican control of Congress. And again, to just give you the big picture, Tomasky suggests this is another age in which on the dominant issue of issues of the day, and some of these issues were still to do with race, to do with Jim Crow and racial hierarchy in the South. Some of them were to do with credit. Some of them were to do with unionization. Some of them were to do with immigration. But that across all the most contentious issues facing America during the Age of Power, the parties were big house, ideologically diverse entities, not split on those issues, but split inside over those issues. And so that to legislate in both of these ages, it was not only necessary, but possible to create cross-party coalitions in Congress, and that this prevented polarization from appearing as partisan polarization, and partisan polarization from crippling our capacity for governance. Now, I'm going to focus on what he calls the Third Age, and I'm going to do so for two reasons. The first is because it continues to inform or maybe haunt our political imaginations, right? The age of consensus is, in a sense, still looming large in the way we think about politics, right? It wasn't that long ago that John McCain is perhaps one of the people who embodied this, or maybe Barack Obama. You think back to that campaign between McCain and Obama, that both of them still tried to conduct themselves as if partisan competition was not blood sport, as if they could reach across partisan divides, as opposed to merely trying to mobilize their own voters as effectively as possible. That's still informing our disappointment with the degree of polarization in the current moment in American politics. And so where did it come from? Are we right to wish that it had continued? And in a sense, Tomasky suggests it's an unrealistic aspiration, that the age of consensus was generated by structural forces primarily. Those structural forces are no longer in place, and so we should not expect our politicians to comport themselves in the way that they used to. There were things that were causing them to do that have been removed. There are other forces in place, and those new forces are causing them to be polarized. So that's one reason to focus on the age of consensus. The second reason is that despite that analysis, Tomasky wants us to do something like figure out how we could revive the age of consensus. And so understanding how we got more consensual politics in the United States is a first step in determining whether we might be able to return to it. And here are his major ideas. The first is that the Great Depression created a situation in which we had an experience of common vulnerability and hardship that made it very difficult to view each other's as not in the same boat, as political enemies, as opposed to as being in a common human situation, right? And he goes into great depth about the extent of deprivation that the Great Depression generated. I'm not going to replay that for you now. This is one of the things I think that is so disconcerting about what's happening with the pandemic, which is to say, it may be not economically, but in terms of public health consequences, and increasingly economically as well, that this is growing to the scale in terms of the extent of vulnerability and deprivation that it's generating, the loss that it's creating, something comparable to the Great Depression. That unified us in the 1930s. Can it possibly unify us in the 2020s? The second factor here was the rise of, and I'm sorry, I should have written socialism. I made a typo there. I was thinking more about how to spell fascism and missed out socialism. The rise of socialism and fascism combined with the Great Depression. Remember, right, the stock market lost 40% of its value in 4 days during the Great Depression, right? And the sense on the part of capitalists in particular, the rich, the owners of resources, that there were alternatives, that those alternatives were increasingly attractive in quite comparable places in the world, and frankly, for a significant segment of the American population here, and the way in which that moderated the demands that capitalists or the investor class made on returns during the Great Depression, their willingness to allow FDR to experiment with redistribution and economic regulation. Not that they necessarily always went along with it without protest, but the sense that there could be a worse alternative to democratic efforts to moderate inequality or protect the most vulnerable in our society. And then a third aspect of this, and this is less structural, more intentional, more an issue of agency. And I'll digress here just for a moment. In the social sciences, we often talk about a dichotomy between structure and agency. Structure is something like the way in which the economy or the state or the voting district is organized. It's a big underlying thing that in a sense shapes our behavior and over which we have very little control unless we can change that structure. And then there's agency, what we can do when we make up our minds to do something within that structure. Right, and so how much does agency have the power to modify structure? How much does structure constrain agency? And here, in a sense, I think what you see is an argument from Tomasky, not quite in these terms, but that structure and agency complemented each other during the age of consensus, which is to say that when people experienced extreme economic deprivation and vulnerability, when they saw, in particular, economic elites saw that this made people perhaps lose some faith in the American system and consider alternatives. The elite, the corporate elite, religious leaders, civic leaders, elected officials made an effort to defend, quote, the American way. And one of the things Tomasky points out, drawing on other historians, is that the phrase the American way was deliberately brought into being as a PR or propaganda campaign in 1930s America, right? And so this was a deliberate project of forming a consensus around the idea that the American way of life was a good way of life, and that we should therefore moderate our conflict and emphasize what unifies or at least brings us together as a way of making sure that we didn't fall into the traps of what these officials in various capacities wanted to describe as anti-American forms of politics or government. Then, of course, we get to World War II, and another vastly painful but also incredibly unifying experience. One, again, that makes it very difficult to see your fellow citizen as an enemy, and makes it very clear who the enemy is and what it means to have an enemy. Right. And that's followed immediately, almost immediately, by the Cold War. Right. And so not a war that puts Democrats and Republicans literally in the trenches or in the same tank or plane or battleship, but nevertheless, well, actually, Korea, Vietnam, some of that, but much more a sense that there is a common enemy. And again, that common enemy then helps us to see what we have in common as a people. And then finally, again, a kind of issue more to do with agency than with structure. When we look specifically at the partisan leaders of the United States in the 1950s and 1960s, what we see is that they regulated their politics by norms of commonality and decency, right? That they always tried to figure out if there was some way to bring their parties together, or at least to treat each other with respect, to deliberate and compromise with each other. And I've put a big qualification in parentheses here, right? And so, glass half empty, glass half full. Yes, the parties were working much better together during the age of consensus, in part because they weren't focusing so much on racism, sexism, because their commitment to anti-communism led them to demand a kind of political conformity and to suspect as enemies people who had views outside of the mainstream, even if they weren't obviously Stalinist operatives. So there were limits on this, but nevertheless, it did result in an era in which the parties were able to work together to get things done. And then that brings us to the age of fracture, which is the age that we're in right now. And here Tomasky suggests that this is the first age in American politics in which two factors are lacking. On the one hand, polarization is not moderated or contained within coalitions combined into parties, right? And so I hope that's clear. But if you're a Democrat in the 1950s, and you've got Southern Democrats who are segregationists and Northern Democrats who are integrationists in your party is not going to take a uniform ideological stance on that position, right? And the Republicans had some splits on these issues as well. And so, right, this is an age in which the parties start to sort out ideologically, and at the same time in which there aren't these structural forces creating any overlap or any sense of commonality. And so unlike the previous three ages in our partisan history, for the first time, polarization is contained within parties. Nothing is moderating it. And this is, on Tomasky's account, why our politics is breaking down. Now, let me very quickly review with you what it is I started talking with you about last week. And I have here, as I believe I previewed for you last week, it's now up to 3 diagrams looking at, or a list that spreads over 3 slides, I guess I should say: culture, economics, technology, globalization, and what's happening in the political parties and the political system. And to get the full picture of what's happening with polarization, we really do have to understand all of this. So let's start with the cultural fissures. Again, this is stuff that we covered together last week. I'll be brief in reviewing it. We have the civil rights movement and the sense that at long last, America really begins to take seriously the idea that equal citizenship is incompatible with racial hierarchy, and that a coalition is built that allows us to pass meaningful civil rights legislation to undo the Jim Crow system, to undo disenfranchisement, segregation, etc. I've spoken with you in the past. I will speak with you again about the inadequacies of the legislation and the reform it generated. But having said all of that, I want to point out that very quickly, right, and this starts with Goldwater and accelerates with Nixon and further proceeds with Ronald Reagan and obviously gets pumped up on steroids with Donald Trump. The Republican Party becomes the party that stands up for a perception on the part of especially white Southerners that they are beleaguered by this, that they are attacked by this, that this is suggesting that they are racist, that their advantages are unearned, and that there's a prioritization of the suffering of African Americans over the suffering of white working class Americans. All of this then articulated by Trump as ethno-nationalist resentment. And so this is rooted in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. And with each of these movements, I think the important thing to see is that we became increasingly split as a country. Was the civil rights movement a necessary advance in justice, or was it a unfair attack on the most deserving members of our society on the part of those who were not fully contributing members? I think you know my answer to that question, but the point is that we've become polarized on that issue, and that polarization is now organized into a partisan divide. Similarly with immigration, right? We have become a much more diverse society, and we are becoming a much more diverse society. That's an ongoing trend as a result of immigration reform that occurred in the middle of the 1960s, and we will quickly become a so-called majority-minority society. Rapid changes in gender roles in the family, the birth control revolution, the way in which that allowed women much greater control over their sexuality, the way in which that resulted in changes in family structures. And just to be clear, right, in 1960, it's less than 10% of children in the United States who are born out of wedlock. It's actually closer to 5%. In today's world, it's more than 50% of children who are born out of wedlock, right? A huge change in family structure. Again, some of us view this as progress, at least with regards to women's sexual liberty and the breaking down of roles that confined women to a very narrow sphere of action. Others see this as destabilizing traditional values, traditional roles, threatening to them. And by the way, some of those people are women, right? Phyllis Schlafly is one of the leaders of the movement for family values, right? Rapid changes in sexuality. Very briefly, right, we now have nationwide legalized same-sex marriage. I would just point out to you, if you go back to 1970, not that far, right, is there a single representation of an openly gay person on television or in a mainstream movie? And I think the answer to that question is obviously no, right? Now it's become much more acceptable to represent homosexuality and homosexuality to be openly present in our midst. Again, quite challenging for some people, quite liberating for others, and that polarization is sorted across party lines. Final issue in terms of cultural fissures. This is a reaction to all of this, combined with the simultaneous decline in traditionally organized religion. The fastest rising category for religious identity is the so-called nones, which means none of the above. When you ask, are you Protestant, are you Catholic, are you Jewish, are you Muslim, are you evangelical, people say none of the above. They don't say I'm agnostic or atheistic. They just say I don't belong to a traditional organized religion. And if you understand the United States as a traditionally Protestant society or a traditionally Christian society, if you think churches have been important in integrating people into our society, especially immigrants, but maintaining the values that our society relies on, both in terms of work and personal morality, but also political ethics, then the erosion of traditional organized religion and the sense that all of these other changes maybe have been an assault on organized religion is for you deeply threatening. If not, it might be, again, importantly progressive. That divide, again, falls into now partisan camps. And so our polarization is in part rooted structurally in major cultural changes of the last 60 years. I am going to stop there. I'm not going to get all the way done with this today, but I do want to leave you a little bit of time to ask questions and make comments. I promise we'll start there next week, and we will complete this and get on to other stuff. Who wants to start us out with a question? It looks like David has his hand up. Go ahead. You will probably have to unmute yourself.
I think I am already. Could you tell us a little bit about the Trumpian work in the Department, not Justice Department, in the Pentagon? What is that about?
Okay, so not directly related to what we're talking about today, right?
No.
And I'm not as up to speed on this as I maybe should be, but you might be referring to the fact that the chief of staff of the Pentagon has blocked Biden's team from getting security briefings, classified information.
Right.
Patel, the loyalist there, is basically saying he doesn't accept the idea that there's a clear transition yet, and so he's not giving information. My understanding is that by Monday that will no longer be possible. So, you know, I guess I don't want to get dragged down into the really petty territorial crap that is happening in this transition. But let me pull back and focus on the fact that there's been a major leadership shakeup in the Department of Defense after the election, right? And I think we might have seen some of what is motivating that after the events of the last few days. I think, you know, to be honest, we may have seen some efforts totally incompetent at preparing the way for a coup, or what's sometimes called an autogolpe, right, where the elected leader attempts to resist lethal power. Trump clearly totally misplayed his hand. You know, the line I like on this is that Donald Trump doesn't have the organizational capacity to get together a one-car funeral. He's not going to put together a coup, right? And so it didn't succeed, but that may have been part of the thought behind this. But I think much more deeply is the idea that he wants to make his policy agenda as irreversible for the next administration as possible. And in order to do that, he needs to prevent the military from, quote, slow walking his orders, right? And you're familiar probably with the term, but the idea is, right, the military gets an order to do something that if done would be irreversible. Oops, I think I'm out sick. Got to take a vacation. That person didn't answer my call, right? So, and you delay it long enough that it doesn't actually take effect before the change of administration. If you put new leadership in place, you might be able to prevent that kind of resistance. And so yesterday, the day before, we saw the remaining American troops removed from Somalia, right? Again, I think in a different partisan climate, this would have been absolutely scandalous, right? The idea of an administration that has already lost an election making a fairly important alteration in national security policy on the way out the door without consultation with the incoming administration, right? But that's the moment we're in right now. And whether that will result in troop withdrawals that will tie Joe Biden and his administration's hands when they come into power in other places in the world, we will just have to see. But that's my analysis on this, is that Trump wanted to have maximal control over the military apparatus, that he needed to get people out of the way to do it, and that he is now trying to set in place policies that will be difficult for Biden to reverse.
Doesn't that just get thrown out with the new administration, though, David?
Say it again. I'm sorry.
Doesn't that just get thrown out with the new administration? These positions?
Yeah, of course, the positions get thrown out or turned over as rapidly as possible. Yeah. We'll have to see how much blockage there is in the Senate, how much obstruction there is to new appointments. But once those troops are out, it's not like it's necessarily easy to get them back in, right? That might have been a long negotiation to get them in. There's infrastructure, there's safety considerations, there's logistical issues. I'll just throw into the mix the assassination of the chief research scientist for the Iranian nuclear project, right? Again, probably carried out by Israel, but almost certainly with at least tacit approval from the United States. Again, an effort to really complicate the latitude that Biden has to rejoin the Iran nuclear accord. John, go ahead.
Very minor point. You said 50% of births in the United States are out of wedlock, and that sounded high to me, and I looked around. I couldn't find anything higher than 40% as of about 5 years ago. Did you actually have a new number on that?
Well, so I am relying on Robert Putnam's Our Kids, which has that figure in it. And so I have not done original research on this, but that's what Putnam writes in that book, and he's
well, Bob Putnam is my old colleague, so I can call him up and ask him if need be. Okay, thank you.
You betcha. And anyone else with a question or a quip at this point? Go ahead, Flossie. And I can't see everyone, so if I'm not seeing your hand, please just make your comment. Don't wait for me. I see 20 of you, but there are 50 of you.
What fascinates me about Tomasky's book is how he leads us into the consumer society. And right now, we're becoming an investing society. That is scary. It's scary, but so many people are investing in making masks, trying to grab the glass market so we can have vials for the vaccine. Like, we don't give a damn what happens to anybody, we're gonna make money. And I think that explains one section, maybe not only of the Republican Party, but the Democrats who want to make a buck too, because making a buck is a way of survival.
Thank you for calling our attention to that, Flossie. It sounds like you're probably reading the book. Yes, so one of the things that Tomasky points out, and I'll get into this a little bit more next week when we get into the economic basis for the age of consensus and the age of fracture, is that we were much less a consumerist society in the 1930s and 1940s, even into the 1950s. And he points out, right, that in the 1930s, you have a certain amount of homes where people own radios, own cars, but still not refrigerators, still not washers and dryers, except for things that you cranked, right? That brand consciousness. One of the funny things he points out is that we didn't have standardized clothing sizes until the late 1930s, right? And so the idea of going to a clothing store and just ordering the size off the shelves wasn't a thing. And so he points out that there tends to be a trade-off in the way in which people think of their identities between consumerism and citizenship. That if you're a consumer, you're much more interested in getting yours. If you're a citizen, you're much more thinking about what is good for us, right? And so, yes, I do think, Flossie, you're definitely putting your finger on one of the really important themes that Tomasky asks us to think about. I'll tell you very quickly, I moved my stepdaughter out of her dorm or her apartment because she's decided to spend the rest of the year at home. And I shipped some of her stuff via UPS to get here. And while I was there, this man walked in with 60 shoe boxes to ship via UPS. And I smiled at him and I said, there's got to be some story behind why you're shipping 60 boxes of shoes. And he just said no. And so after he walked out, I asked to the person at the UPS store, is that a typical thing? And he smiled and he said, yeah, that guy comes in every day with 60 pairs of shoes. He's a reseller, right? He buys the shoes when they first come out, waits for them to be scarce, and then sells them for double or triple what the original price was, right? We know about this with tickets to sporting events and concerts and stuff now, but this appears to be increasingly ubiquitous in our economy, this idea that we try to leverage making a buck wherever we can. And that certainly also puts us in a more competitive mindset as opposed to a cooperative one. All right. I'm not, Suzanne, go ahead.
Yeah, this is something that I had left over from last week. You ended on the note that the South was now completely in the Republican camp because they were voting not just for the top of the ticket, but also for the bottom of the ticket. Is that like, and since that tendency really began around the time that Johnson took up civil rights, would it be correct to see this then as a consolidation, a final consolidation of a tendency that began several decades ago?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Suzanne. And I want to make clear that the point I was making last week is actually an analogous point, which is you got to wonder whether we're seeing something similar with affluent suburbs now, which have been fairly reliably Republican for the last 40 years. And they voted more for Biden than they had in the previous election, voted for Clinton. They voted more for Obama as well. But are the affluent suburbs doing what the southern states did 60 years ago, slowly moving from being Republican to being Democratic, right? In which case there would be a different way to read what happened in 2020. But coming back to the point on the South, you've got it absolutely right. What Tomasky points out is that LBJ when he signed the civil rights legislation, says the Democrats are losing the South for a generation. Tomasky points out he was optimistic. They lost it for 3 generations, right? And so we're seeing in Georgia right now, we're seeing maybe in Virginia and North Carolina, some demographic and then political change in the South. But it's been a long time coming, right? And it didn't get there to Texas, obviously, despite the hopes of some Democrats this time. So yes, the point is absolutely right. And then it has relevance also for the contemporary moment as well.
Go away, Julie. I have to figure out how to turn my Zoom off here.
Oh, okay, everybody. I am going to say good day. Take care. Have a good week. Be safe. And I will see you all next Saturday. Bye, guys.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Take care.